One of our projects is to enrich people's understanding of spirituality. People think of spirituality in a lot of different ways, and it looks as though the term's almost intractable for any serious or rigorous use. It's just people disagree too much. How can you possibly use it? But I was very impressed by research by some sociologists and psychologists, including Nancy Emmerman here at Boston University, who managed to show that there are actually recurring patterns in the way the word and idea spirituality gets used.
In the most recent research that I've done, we asked people to tell us stories about their everyday lives, and we were particularly listening for where anything religious or spiritual entered into those stories. So where their lives sort of intersected with that dimension of their lives, with something that was beyond the ordinary, if you will.
What we wanted to do was to, in this other research group, was to produce a richer account that was cross-culturally more robust and that could be supported by a survey that could be administered online, so that we could cheaply study spirituality across cultures with anyone who could speak in the languages of the survey.
And so looking through all of these different instances of people talking about spirituality and thinking, well, you know, obviously people are meaning a lot of different things by this, but it's not like everybody's meaning their own individual different thing about this. So there's some kind of recurring ways that people use this term.
The Dimensions of Spirituality project is trying to figure out what aspects of spirituality are the most important to people, what dimensions of it. So we tried to develop, I think, 5 dimensions and then a bunch of sub-dimensions underneath all of those. And really just trying to figure out which parts of those are kind of essential to how people understand spirituality or their spirituality.
We worked on it, and we figured that we could locate about 20 different sub-dimensions of spirituality. They cluster into about 5 major dimensions by hypothesis.
Are these dimensions, we're sort of hypothesizing, really there? Do they show up when people take the tests? And do they correlate with each other in any interesting way, either positively or negatively? When people say spiritual but not religious, does that mean that they're not interested in the belief and belonging part, but more in the sense of axiological cultivation of these sort of ideals? Does it mean that they tend to have experiences of awe in nature? You know, just trying to get a lay of the land and see if there's any sort of patterns where these dimensions fit together in unique ways.
It struck Professor Wildman, I think, that it was possible that what I was identifying, because it has a lot of resonance with other work about spirituality, that what I was identifying was perhaps actually about some dimensions, that there were some identifiable kind of pieces, I guess you might say, of the whole that might constitute spirituality, and that these might be identifiable or measurable a little more efficiently than going out and spending hours at a time interviewing people. So that if we had an instrument, if we had some questions that could be asked more efficiently, that it might be useful to be able to tap the breadth of things that spirituality means.
The ethical aspects of life people would often include as spiritual. People think of spiritual as their religious communities, the sense of belonging to a community, experiences of awe, whether in nature or in a church or wherever, the sense of feeling, you know, small before something sort of transcendent.
And then there's the ethical spirituality that just about everybody agrees that if you want to call yourself a spiritual person, you better be good. That they want to be able to see this in people's lives.
All these different layers of spirituality, we're trying to develop a survey that can pick up on these different layers, these different dimensions that is what we're calling it, and to see if those dimensions relate to each other in reliable ways across different populations. Such that there might be sort of an underlying structure of what spirituality is, that it's not just a word that we're throwing around, but there is some sort of undergirding.
So what we were able to do was to identify sort of ground up, here's how this term is actually being used by a fairly representative sample of Americans in their everyday storytelling.
Just a recognition that spirituality, whatever it is we're pointing to when we use this word, is a very complicated thing, which we can tell based on the things that people are willing to associate with it.
And then the one thing that I did add was a kinesthetic subdimension, bodily awareness of their spirituality, and if that's something that's important to them, whether it be through physical movements in prayer or singing or rituals, or things that are kind of outside of the box, like yoga or dancing or running, things that we don't typically think of as religious or spiritual, but people feel that they're spiritual experiences for them.
This is a classic example of what you can do when you take religion's complexity seriously. It's so complex we can't study it properly using scientific methods. That's one attitude. Another attitude is, let's simplify it. We're going to simplify it so much that a religious studies person can't even recognize it anymore, and then what we do scientifically won't ever win respect over there. So both of those extremes are, from my point of view, losers.
They started adding some other things into the mix, and I don't know how many dimensions they've ended up with at this point. Because once you turn a bunch of philosophers and religious studies people loose, you end up, I think, with a much broader array of things than what sort of ordinary people of the population might come up with.
Why not find pieces that you can study scientifically with great sophistication, using the science to increase the sophistication of the interpretation on the humanities and religious studies side? Quite often you can do that. And that's a classic example in the Dimensions of Spirituality inventory. It's an area where science can help increase the sophistication of the interpretation that you have inside psychology of religion and inside the scientific study of religion on the social sciences side.
So we have to pare down the survey. The final survey will be 40 items. And then I believe there is a group that wants to use it for spirituality and health research.
The Dimensions of Spirituality survey, which is on exploringmyreligion.org, is one of our users' favourite surveys because it gives such interesting, thought-provoking feedback. When you take it, you see these 20 different dimensions of your spirituality organised in such a way that you see how, for example, your interest in aesthetic things is stronger or weaker than the average, or maybe your tendency to appreciate ritual, or your confidence in ancestors and their role in your spirituality, these sorts of things. I found it myself illuminating to take that survey, even though I designed the instrument.
The Dimensions of Spirituality project began with a survey of literature and personal testimonials on spirituality. Based on this research, we generated almost 24 subdimensions of spirituality, which we used to build a research survey called the Dimensions of Spirituality Inventory, or DSI. We gathered data online, and what we discovered was striking. Our hypothesis about the way the subdimensions would cluster into major dimensions wasn't confirmed. Instead, we discovered 5 meaningful dimensions that showed how our diverse participants actually thought about and experienced spirituality. Dimension 1, religious meaning. This dimension involves belief, meaning, and self-transformation. It's a classic religious factor, reflecting the priorities of major religious traditions. Dimension 2, aesthetic mysticism. This dimension indicates sensitivity to oneness or transcendence and appreciation for awe, beauty, and questing for truth. This is a mystical outlook factor, drawing together aesthetics and mysticism. Dimension 3, ritual traditions. This dimension embraces ritual and religious tradition, including community. It describes rituals which create spiritual meaning and forge social connections. Dimension 4, Ethical Supernaturalism. This dimension involves deference to ancestors and divine beings. It has a supernatural cast, focusing on transcendent, morally concerned spirits or gods. Dimension 5, Embodied Spiritualism. This dimension is about bodies as well as spiritual beings such as demons, angels, or bodhisattvas. This project has developed a sensitive way to express varied aspects of real-life spirituality. The DSI survey will be useful for research that requires a complex, valid measure of subjects' spiritual sensibilities.